along to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to yet another edition of Prog and Psych Picks. If you've seen any of the previous videos on this topic, then you'll know the drill by now. Up for discussion today are 4 very different progressive and/or psychedelic releases, brought together due to the simple fact that they're all stored next to one another in my collection. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. We start this episode with an intriguing album by Bernard Szajner, Some Deaths Take Forever, from 1980. Okay, so Szajner is a French fella who'd spent time in the 70s working with acid trash heroes like Gong and Magma, as well as bigger bands like The Who, doing their lighting and designing visual effects, eventually going on to pioneer the commercial use of lasers. Then, towards the end of the decade, he started making electronic music. His debut, Visions of June, emerging in 1979 under the alias Zed, inspired, as you might expect, by the legendary science fiction novel Dune. The Zed record is very much still on my want list, so hopefully I'll be able to track that down before long. But yeah, in the meantime, let's talk about Some Deaths Take Forever. Now, Szajner apparently intended this LP as a kickback against what he saw as the prettification of electronic music at the time. By that I assume he meant the emerging new age and synth pop scenes, as well as the more melodic output of the so-called Berlin school. So yeah, basically he wanted to craft something much uglier. And yeah, the opener, Welcome to Death Row, certainly starts in a rather confrontational, unmelodious place, with harsh, distorted beats sizzling away over a spaceship from hell sequencer pattern, which continues for the rest of the piece. Very quickly though, this is offset by a surprisingly melodic piano theme, which is occasionally interrupted by fuzzy guitar freakery or some downcast robot vocals, but eventually wins out, whipping the track into an almost triumphant fervour through its incessant repetition. Ritual is next, starting with more of that free-form fuzz guitar and an almost parasitic sequencer line, the track's wordless chant vocals from Klaus Blasquez, taking things firmly into Zeuhl territory. This, of course, makes sense, as he was once the lead singer with the aforementioned Magma, who pioneered said movement. Though this one kinda reminds me more of the obscure Parisian electro-Zeuhl combo a.k.a., who put out a wonderful album in 1977. The severely titled Execute opens with more wordless vocals over glassy electric piano and an ultra-dark and brooding Zeuhl synth riff, the track eventually breaking off into tense, gritty electro-minimalism and fractured industrial beats. Funnily enough, Szajner then embraces melodicism again for much of the remainder of the LP. Okay, so the epic Resurrector features plenty of potentially disruptive free-form drumming and increasingly strange guitar work, though all the while its classic-era Tangerine Dream-styled sequencer remains defiant, bubbling away merrily in the background. On the other hand, The Memory, yet another sequencer-powered track, is wholly tuneful, shot through with a delightful, almost carnival-esque jazzy playfulness. Admittedly, the penultimate track, Suspended Animation, is pretty out there, though it's more what I'd call quirky than outright ugly or dissonant, along the same lines as Cluster circa Zuckerzeit perhaps, whilst the closer, A Kind of Freedom, as clunky and robotic as it is on the surface, sports a beautifully expressive, almost easy listening or jazz fusion chord progression at its core. So yeah, not quite the dark, disturbing, synthesized hellscape that you might expect or hope for going off Szajner's description, but still a very fine piece of vintage, progressive electronic music all the same. Whilst Some Deaths is ostensibly a concept record about life in prison, as with the Requiem album I spoke about a few videos back, it's instrumental enough to just enjoy on its own if you prefer. Anyways, this 2009 CD reissue adds 3 bonus pieces, recorded in 1982. These are purely electronic works, the highlight for me being the middle one, a single broken wing, which, with its strangely catchy central theme, again betrays the distinct influence of Zeuhl on Szajner's composing. We move on to a project known simply as Time, a short-lived American quartet who made the recordings found on this CD in early 1968, after which they expanded their lineup slightly and changed their name to Think Dog later on that same year. Now, as far as I'm aware, neither project had any of their music released back in the day, until the ever-trustworthy Shadoks label belatedly made it happen in the 2000s. In fact, for several decades, these Time recordings were feared lost, though, luckily for us, the tapes did finally show up, and yeah, Before There Was Time is the end result. Okay, so Time were an eclectic bunch to say the least, ostensibly rooted in what we now know as psychedelic folk rock, though, as we'll get onto, they weren't averse to factoring in unexpected, oftentimes avant-garde, wildcard influences along the way. And yeah, Opener, A Song for You, is a great example of their idiosyncratic approach. Its freeform intro, backed by sonorous sub-bass and ominous, proto-industrial metallic shriekings, before things open out into pretty, if rather hazy and zonked out, acid baroque ballad territory. Then, following a deceptively innocent whistle refrain, straight off an incredible string band album, Time decide to open a veritable Pandora's box of audio chaos on our poor unsuspecting ears, with sheets of wild guitar shred and sampled orchestral syrup, leading into an overwhelmingly dense deluge of electronically processed noise. After these 2 minutes of madness, the group then calmly resume their genteel folk ballad, pretending as if nothing has just happened. The brief Kemp's Jig, a traditional piece from the 16th century, which folk rock nerds may also recognise as the opening tune on the first Griffin album, acts as a palate cleanser, before Time plunge us head first into introductory lines, a paranoid psych waltz with noisy, atonal electronics pushed way up front in the mix. Yeah, file this piece next to the contemporaneous work of other freak-out electronic pioneers like 50 Foot Hose, the United States of America, Silver Apples, White Noise, and their Shadoks label mates, the Spoils of War. Staying at the freakier end of the album, the song At Shadow's Eye is also of note. A nice bit of Velvets meets Red Crayola psychedelic minimalism, featuring angry bursts of noisy fuzz in amidst John Calian piano hammering and tribal, tom-heavy drum pounding. Reading the liner notes here, Time man Lynn David Newton reveals that the band used to perform Velvet Underground cover songs in their live sets, and actually ended up meeting Cale and Lou Reed when the latter two dropped by Time's rehearsal space one time, as they wanted to try out some of their equipment. Drummer David Rosenboom would also go on to play with the legendary Theatre of Eternal Music, with whom Cale and original Velvet's drummer Angus MacLeese had performed earlier on in the 60s. Whilst much of the remainder of Before There Was Time is on the quieter side of things, the tunes are no less unpredictable and diverse. Sad Benjamin, for example, has a moody, almost Latin American feel. Then, towards the back end of the record, the rootsy instrumental hoedown, Mars Pan, leads into Dover Beach, a swinging number akin to Revolver-era Beatles reimagining the Kinks' Sunny Afternoon. Elsewhere, the quirky, stuttering psych folk of Lily Has a Rose makes me think of Mormos. Funnily enough, a group formed in France by Jim Cuomo shortly after the aforementioned Spoils of War disbanded, whilst the chiming, echo guitar-laden waking could pass for a long-lost Simon and Garfunkel outtake, albeit one drenched in a certain mind-altering chemical. Then Ealing Experience closes things on a similarly modal tip. It's tasty, 7-time raga jazz groove, pushed along nicely by a propulsive bass line, which brings to mind some of the recordings by the thoroughly psyched up post-Van Morrison Them. So yeah, not your average acid folk album by any stretch. If it had actually been released at the time, in the late 60s, before there was time, would no doubt be rightly regarded as a daring and groundbreaking cult psychedelic classic. So yeah, it's a great shame that these pieces had to wait so long to be heard, and as a result, have remained highly obscure. As I said earlier though, I guess we're just lucky to have them at all and that they weren't completely lost to oblivion. Next today we have Tuesday, April 19th, the 1968 debut album by the Unspoken Word, another American project, and another that drew quite heavily from the then blossoming psychedelic folk scene, at least on this album. Yeah, looks like they changed their sound quite drastically by the time of their second, self-titled LP, which is apparently much harder and bluesier. Anyways, weirdly, this one almost picks up where the Time CD left off, in the form of Anniversary of My Mind, a glorious little sliver of buzzy raga folk, again with one of those hypnotic, gulping bass lines, sweetened by occasional sweeps of florid, baroque orchestration. Followers of the electric psychedelic sitar head swirlers compilation series may recognise this tune as it appears on Volume 7. Horn and string arrangements are quite a prominent feature on Tuesday, April 19th, readily bringing to mind the previous year's evergreen classic Forever Changes by Love, not least on the weirdly theatrical For the World, which is so very Arthur Lee in its chromatic chordal shifts and unpredictable rhythmic structure that you'd swear he had a hand in it, but no, apparently not. Now, the Unspoken Word featured two front people, principal songwriter and guitarist Gene Stashuk, who provides the lead on the first two numbers, and Dee Dee Puma, whose sweet tones come to the fore on Waking Up, a co-write with Stashuk, which starts deceptively in suitably sleepy and peaceful acoustic territory, before springing to life and revealing itself as a none more 60s groover. Puma also features prominently on the gorgeously dreamy, string-laden ballad After the Before, another one she co-wrote, and the moody, evocative Flock of Birds, as well as the charmingly ploddy Beatles Go Psych folk effort Distant Oh So Far, which may very well be my favourite song here, along with the aforementioned opener and the wonderful penultimate piece, Sunday Suit of Clothes, a satisfyingly fruity slice of orchestrated pop psych that I'm frankly amazed hasn't yet been picked up on for inclusion on a volume of Fading Yellow. Admittedly, attempting to choose a favourite on a high-quality LP such as this is a pretty futile task. That said, it's not quite perfect. Yeah, unfortunately, the closer, We're Growing, is a huge misstep, with its ugly marching band instrumentation and annoying beyond belief sub-cheerleader chant vocals. Yeah, horrible. Luckily then, this Fallout CD reissue comes with 4 decent bonus single sides to clear the air after that stinker. Boy was the A-side of the group's debut 7-inch from 1966, and it's a nice, if rather syrupy soft pop ballad, delivered effectively by Ms. Puma. The other A-side, On a Beautiful Day, is the Unspoken Word at their most joyous. A bouncy bit of whimsical, carefree harmony pop in the style of the Free Design and their sunny, sugar-coated ilk. Corny as hell, but weirdly affecting all the same. Of these four extras, the soft, mellow, summer evening psych of And It's Gone points the way forward most explicitly to what the group would do on their debut full length. And yeah, if anything, this would have made a much better album closer than the cruddy We're Growing, which could have been eternally consigned to the vaults for my taste. Anyways, as with the Time album, or maybe Definition by Chrysalis, overall, Tuesday, April 19th is a pleasingly eclectic mix of both commercial and underground stylings, with many of the songs consistently wrong-footing you and shifting genres every few bars, though somehow the album still feels organically put together and of one unified piece. And despite being very brief, yeah, even with the bonus tracks, the CD clocks in at just over 30 minutes. All the shifts in style and tone somehow make the album feel much longer, though not in a bad way. Yeah, excellent stuff for the most part. Gene Stay Shook would later turn up in Red 7, an AOR band from the 80s, whose debut LP was produced by Mike Rutherford of Genesis and Mike and the Mechanics fame. Yeah, now customary bit of bonus trivia for you there. We finished today's episode with, forgive my pronunciation, Zeuhl, the infamous fifth long player by the legendary Brazilian musician Caetano Veloso. As is well documented, this was the first album Veloso recorded after returning to his homeland, following a 2-year period of political exile in London. And yeah, talk about all over the place. Yeah, as with pretty much everything I've talked about today, this 1972 effort is unpredictable to say the least, flitting between styles with reckless glee, and ultimately a great sense of creative liberation. Opening with a brief voice and percussion piece, the traditional viola mu bem, we're then confronted with Diconversa, a bizarre, purely atonal bit of sound poetry, consisting of a multi-track Veloso, mumbling, whistling, wailing and humming along with himself, things eventually coalescing into Crevo e Canella, a joyous but still somewhat unsettling melody, backed by clapping and heavy-handed piano, the whole thing coming over like the Brazilian equivalent of Zappa's disturbing It Can't Happen Here. After these 6 minutes of freakery, the gorgeous chilled ballad Tu Me Acostumbraste, a cover of the most widely known song by Cuban composer Frank Dominguez, is on hand to add a bit of form to proceedings. Yeah, for fans of Veloso's more accessible material, this, along with the similarly mellow and pretty samba groover Julia Moreno, is about as normal as Zeuhl gets. Otherwise, all bets are pretty much off with the remainder of the tunes. Indeed, Gilberto Misterioso is next, in which a playful, childlike and somewhat annoying melody bookends a low-key stretch of improv for piano, voice and acoustic guitar, whilst De Palavra en Palavra returns us briefly to the atonal sound poetry from earlier. As the first half of the LP comes to a close, Veloso & Co. finally decide to switch on the electricity for the medley of De Cara and Eu Quero Essa Mulher, which begins life as a loose, rickety rock groover, in which Veloso quickly dispenses with his vocal duties, before things really start to cook, with a chap named Lanny on fuzzy freak-out guitar duties, whilst drummer Tutti Moreno goes positively ape on his kit, even breaking into blast beat territory on a few occasions. Things simmering down after a mere 4 minutes. Yeah, I would have loved a 14-minute version of this song, but we can't have it all, I suppose. Come to think of it, this one would have slotted nicely onto the feverish, jammed-out third side of the legendary double LP Paibiru by Lula Cortez and Zaira Malho. But yeah, speaking of epics, the second half gets underway with Sugarcane Fields Forever, an astonishing musique concrète assemblage, which crossfades between sections of quiet ambience, ecstatic percussion-backed hollering, bizarre atonal orchestration, brassy spy movie music, horizontally laid-back jazz folk, and chintzy, chicken-in-a-basket easy listening entirely as it pleases, pretty much condensing Arasa Zeuhl's entire eccentric sound palette into 10 head-spinning minutes. Yeah, after this showstopper, in truth, the LP doesn't offer up much in the way of surprises from this point onwards, though the penultimate piece, Epico, is cool, opening with further, almost Bond-theme-worthy brassy bombast, before going completely off-piste, with Veloso singing forlornly over lo-fi field recordings of traffic noise, the brass skulking ominously in the background, before surging forward again for one last blowout. The record then concludes with the title track, an 80-second miniature juxtaposing a tremulous vocal performance against naggingly atonal guitar picking, closing things out as sparsely and as unassumingly as they began. So yeah, possibly the strangest album of the 4 discussed today, and from what I can gather, this is far and away Veloso's weirdest long player overall. Yeah, I'm certainly no expert on his catalogue, though I do own a handful of others, including the follow-up to this, and I don't recall any of them being anywhere near as experimental. Whilst it's most definitely grating in spots, with some of the tunes not particularly holding up to repeat spins, there are still enough high points here to make it worth keeping hold of. So that'll just about do it for today. Hopefully this video has given you something new and interesting to check out, or at least to dig out for another spin. As I always say, there's plenty more content to come along similar lines, so please hit subscribe to be kept fully up to date on all future episodes. Thanks as ever for watching, and I'll catch you again on the Acid Trash Jamboree.